So we're to the last chapter of the mini-series on manuscript preparation. What happens when your manuscript is returned to you? In this podcast, we'll look at some of the decisions to be made and some of the important things to remember when you're going through either rejection or return for major revisions. This is not particularly what you want to see in your inbox as you eagerly await your paper getting published. Or in fact this. Seriously, after all that work. The first response is to be upset, annoyed, or angry, but try to limit the amount of head exploding that goes on. As cliché as this image is already, it's got a point. There is nobody out to get you, nor is this an indictment against your personal capabilities or your intelligence. What I would recommend is that you park the email for a while and try to forget about it until you're in a frame of mind to deal with it. Then, read the reviewer comments with as much objectivity as you can muster. One thing to watch for is whether the reviewer has missed something critical about the design or question. I've had that happen once to a paper, and the comments were nearly all off point. However, this is not a common situation, so you can't blame that for everything. The second question is whether the reviewers feel that this work is so far from acceptable that it will probably never meet journal acceptance. It becomes an issue of a bad question or bad design versus a badly constructed paper. There are many manuscripts that are guilty of both, but only one of those options is probably fixable. However, the whole point of having a mentor and having this research program is to avoid the situation where the study has to die at this point. It's a waste of time and effort to get this far and realize it can't fly. Some decisions await you and your preceptor at this point once you've both looked at the comments. If it's your first time, the list of revisions may seem insurmountable. However, having been through this process many times now, I've gained the experience to look at the list and see that most of the time, criticism is answerable. If the reviewers seem to have missed the point, you have a couple of options, both of which involve revising, clarifying, and resubmitting. The time where my manuscript was returned and it was clear that the reviewer had bypassed a critical feature, I simply reformatted and went to a different journal, and things rolled out from there without much incident. If you do that, make sure that your study hasn't made it difficult for other people to understand it. If it suffered from poor writing and poor presentation, it is a potentially solvable problem. However, you may need to enlist help to improve the data presentation, the flow of ideas, spelling, grammar, and so forth to make it acceptable. As a journal reviewer, I have rejected papers simply because the writing is so bad that I can't even evaluate the science. It is my hope that you never submit a paper in that condition. If all else fails, ask your research director to look it over. The fatal flaw issue is a tough one, and it takes tremendous insight to identify it. Ideally speaking, however, if you had that level of insight, one would hope it would have kicked in before this stage. As with everything, there's an approach and an etiquette to follow when responding to reviewers. First and foremost, be polite. The reviewers may have shredded your masterpiece, but you still need to thank them for their time and efforts. In the vast majority of cases, they are volunteering their time to improve and protect the repository of evidence that we all use to make decisions in patient care. This was not a personal attack. You also need to be diplomatic in your approach if some of the suggestions and comments seem silly or are in conflict with your own opinions. These are example statements from previous responses to reviewers that I've written. I'm not going to say that I've never gotten terse with reviewers, but that particular situation was at a third round of revisions, forced by a reviewer doubling down on relatively ignorant comments about statistical inference. You generally can't afford to be rude to people who can torpedo your acceptance. You do need to pick your battles. There will be a lot of suggestions that can help streamline your language or pick up small errors in grammar and spelling that you've missed. I recommend you simply accept the suggestions and make the changes. It is not required that you simply accept every suggestion if the meaning or fundamental aspects of the paper are at risk. What you do have to do is explain or answer the questions and criticisms and consider modifying your manuscript to help illustrate your point better. Sometimes you just have to say that there is no answer to the question, but clarify as much as you're able. For these areas, work with your preceptor because they may have an approach to the unanswerable. There may also be times where you have to gently remind your reviewer of the key points. If you do that, look at your manuscript and make sure that you haven't obscured them. These are more excerpts. I've taken the line numbers away, but what journals will want you to do is to list the comments and your answer together in order. Remember, if you've written that you've changed it, make sure you've actually changed it. The last advice is to make sure that you read and follow the journal guidelines for responses to reviewers. Most will simply want you to have the question and answer in order, but some will ask you to construct a table. Make sure that your revised manuscript aligns with the changes you've alluded to in your response. Modify your cover letter to reflect that you're resubmitting a revised manuscript. Finally, beware revision deadlines. A lot of journals will give you a do-or-die date, and if you miss it, you get to start over. It may be time-consuming, but a diligent approach to revisions can get you to the point of acceptance. This excerpt was taken from probably the most rigorous set of revisions I've ever worked through, such that the response to the reviewers was longer than the entire manuscript. But we won, and the paper was published in a high-impact journal. I do feel the paper was better for it, but persistence was definitely required. There's a cost-benefit analysis required to determining whether you revise and resubmit to the same journal. Even if you elect to change journals, take the reviewer remarks in mind and change what you can before you resubmit anywhere. My experience is that people will tend to independently pick up on major issues, so save yourself some time. On the side of revising and resubmitting to the same journal, you're already formatted for it, and unless the comments are dire, you're likely to succeed. On the downside, there may be more than one round of revisions, and you do risk not being able to satisfy the reviewers in the end. On the side of switching journals, you do get a fresh start, and you may draw a more sympathetic set of reviewers. On the downside, you'll have to reformat everything, and you may get a less sympathetic group of reviewers instead. This is a shared decision with you and your preceptor. In conclusion, having your paper sent back for major revisions or rejected outright is usually not the end of the world. For most manuscripts, there is a solution, whether it's revising or simply choosing a different journal. However, there are some projects that are simply not publishable. Ideally, with good planning, this shouldn't happen, but it does. This is always a sad situation, but occasionally they just need to be buried, and you and your mentor need to move on. So this is the last podcast in the series of Intro to Research. If you've made it through all 21, congratulations. Hopefully they've been helpful to you in your work, and they'll remain here for you to refer back to in future. This is Marlis Sabo signing off.